Today, we're going to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome. And let's start off by understanding what the experience of having imposter syndrome is like. So people with imposter syndrome oftentimes feel like imposters. They feel like they're living a fake life. They tend to be terrified that one day someone will figure out that they don't actually belong. They sort of have this impression of themselves that they've somehow managed to skate by and trick everyone into thinking that they're competent. And so they always kind of feel like the house of cards is about to come tumbling down. So it's a very stressful experience to feel like an imposter and to have imposter syndrome. Hey there, thanks for watching, and I'm glad these videos have been helpful. A lot of times I'll read the comments and see people asking, well, what do I actually do about it? Which is a great question. And unfortunately, the resources out there haven't been that great, which is precisely why I started HG in the first place. HG coaches are trained on a curriculum that integrates my understanding of what motivates us, what paralyzes us, and most importantly, what leads to lasting behavioral change. If you're ready to take the next step, HG coaches can help you build the life that you want. They've helped people build careers, help people find relationships, build networks of friends, and even do things like discover their passions or pursue hobbies. So if this sounds like something that you'd be interested in, check out the link in the description below. There are a couple of other key features which are really important to understand. The most important is actually that someone's accomplishments don't actually lead to a sense of competence. So if we look at a normal person, when I succeed or accomplish something, what tends to happen is my self-esteem gets a boost, right? Like, after all, I was successful, I did a good job, I should feel better about myself. But with someone with imposter syndrome, the opposite actually happens. When someone with imposter syndrome succeeds or accomplishes something, instead of it actually boosting their competence, they somehow arrive at the conclusion that they've faked it, that they don't actually deserve to be successful. They didn't actually achieve something through their own effort. And so paradoxically, the better they do, the worse they feel about themselves. And so where does imposter syndrome really come from? How does someone start to think this way? And so research shows that it actually begins usually in childhood. So there are two main sort of profiles of people who develop imposter syndrome. The first profile is sibling of a golden child or gifted kid. So these are situations in which someone grew up having usually an older sibling who's very, very accomplished. And frequently that families would make comparisons between the person who eventually develops imposter syndrome and the golden child. So these are situations in which growing up, parents will say things like, oh, your older sibling is so smart, they're so talented, they do such a good job. It seems like the older sibling is effortlessly successful. And meanwhile, you've got the younger sibling who's terrified and struggling to keep up because they've got very, very big shoes to fill, a lot of parental expectations. And if my older brother and sister are able to do it, I should be able to do it too. The other interesting thing is that the other group of kids who grew up to have imposter syndrome actually deal with those pressures directly themselves. They are sort of viewed as a gifted kid or golden child. And these kids tend to come from high achieving families that put a lot of pressure on their kids. And the key thing here is that parents of children who grow up to have imposter syndrome will appreciate the child's accomplishments, but won't appreciate or actually denigrate the efforts that the child has to go through. So these are parents who wouldn't sort of say, hey, you got an A, that's a really good job. You must have worked really, really hard to get that A. In fact, what these parents will do is they'll sort of assume that the child should get an A, right? Because you're smart and because we're smart and because you're so smart and talented, everything should be easy for you. And so when they start to deal with a child who sort of, and kind of put a pressure on them that everything should be easy for you, what does that do to the child? It creates a very, very scary situation where, oh, I managed to do a good job, which is what I was supposed to do, right? So like I got an A, that's what I'm supposed to do, but it's supposed to be easy for me, but it was hard for me. And so what starts to happen is they start to lose confidence in themselves, and they start to believe that achievement should be effortless in nature. And if I am having to work hard to get an A, then there must be something wrong with me. So these are the two backgrounds that lead to imposter syndrome. If we kind of tunnel down to what is the common shared feature, the most common feature of imposter syndrome is this idea that the more success you have, the more you accomplish, the less competent you feel in yourself. And this is something that I got super interested in. So when I was doing my residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, we got a lot of kids who were like college students from MIT and Harvard and places like that. And I saw something really bizarre, which is that these kids should feel really confident in themselves, right? These are some of the smartest kids, most talented kids, most accomplished kids in university in the United States. And yet they have really bad self-esteem problems. And as I continued working with kind of like high achievers, I noticed that imposter syndrome kept on cropping up over and over and over again. And I got kind of confused, right? Because as I worked with like bankers from places like Goldman Sachs or like, other really talented people, entrepreneurs, CEOs, things like that, game developers from like, very prestigious companies, I was super surprised that I was seeing more and more and more imposter syndrome. And so I started to think a little bit about, okay, hold on a second, like, why is this? Okay, so we sort of know that the more you accomplish, you're not able to develop a sense of competence. But why is it that all of these people at high-performing institutions are winding up with imposter syndrome? Because I thought that imposter syndrome is like a bad thing, right? These are people who are suffering with imposter syndrome. They're stressed out all the time. They're afraid that everything is going to come crashing down around them. But this is when I sort of realized that imposter syndrome isn't a bug, it's actually a feature. And if you look at research on imposter syndrome, what you begin to realize, and if you work with these people, is that the reason that imposter syndrome is so prevalent and is so hard to deal with is because it's actually an advantage in some ways. So imposter syndrome is essentially an adaptive response. It's something that's a painful adaptation. It's an adaptation that leads to suffering, but it's absolutely an adaptation. So let's understand why imposter syndrome is actually hard to kick and what it actually does for people. So let's start by looking at a normal person, okay? So a normal person works really, really, really hard, and then they accomplish something. They succeed in some way. And when they succeed in something, they feel good about themselves. And what do? They go out and they celebrate. On the flip side, someone with imposter syndrome, when they work really, really, really hard and they achieve something, how do they feel about themselves? They feel terrified. They feel like, oh my God, I got so lucky. I barely scraped by. I got so lucky that the professor likes me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten an A. And so what do they do after they get an A? They actually double their efforts. They actually work twice as hard. They don't relax at all. They actually work harder. Because remember, if in your mind you are maintaining this elaborate facade that could come crumbling down around you at any moment, you can't relax at all, right? Because if you make a single mistake, everything's going to come tumbling down. You have no sense of reserve. You have no sense of resilience. You can't rely on things to work for you. And it's because you're kind of like screwing up, right? Like you're on the verge of everything coming crashing down. So there's no room for relaxation. And so now we can begin to see that the behavior of someone with imposter syndrome actually leads them to more and more success, which is precisely why you have more and more imposters in more successful places. And for the record, back in residency, I did a lot of work with like homeless people. I worked in a jail for a few months, and I didn't see a single case of imposter syndrome in the homeless population. There aren't people out there who are like, oh my God, I'm not really homeless. Like people are going to figure this out and then everything is going to come crashing around. In fact, imposter syndrome correlates with outward achievement. And so this is the really bizarre thing, is that these are people who should feel really confident in themselves. In fact, imposter syndrome, just as a quick historical side note, was actually discovered in high-functioning and high-performing women who, despite the fact that they were very, very successful, felt like imposters. So now that we understand that imposter syndrome actually encourages people to work extra hard and is sort of like an adaptation that leads to more success and accomplishment, how do we tackle this? And this is where things get a little bit tricky, because technically, imposter syndrome is not actually a psychiatric diagnosis. So you can't be diagnosed with imposter syndrome because it's not even officially recognized by therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists. And furthermore, it's not something that the average psychologist or psychiatrist or therapist gets any training in. So if you look at the formal kind of curriculum that therapists get trained in, imposter syndrome usually has 0 hours of training. And this is something, unfortunately, that we've had to deal with at Healthy Gamer, because we get a lot of clients in our coaching program who've actually tried therapy and discovered that the amount of help that they got with imposter syndrome was highly variable. So the therapists were really good at dealing things with like anxiety disorders and mood disorders, but unfortunately, we've seen a lot of unfortunate outcomes in terms of imposter syndrome in therapy. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't get help from a therapist, and I've worked with a bunch of people with imposter syndrome, and I think I've been able to help them a lot. I have a lot of colleagues who've been very successful, but you should know that your mileage may vary. So today, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about how imposter syndrome gets maintained so that you can challenge some of the cognitive patterns that you may be dealing with. So researchers have discovered something really interesting when it comes to imposter syndrome. Since it's not really a diagnosis, it kind of gets maintained through particular patterns. So unlike something like a mood disorder, which may be like neurotransmitter mediated or things like that, like maybe a serotonin deficiency, or for example, a panic disorder is an inappropriate activation of your adrenaline system, it seems like imposter syndrome is actually reinforced through particular cognitive patterns. And what we're going to share with you today is what those patterns are, how to find them, and even how to counteract them. So the first pattern involving imposter syndrome is not attributing your success to your effort. So if you talk to an imposter and you ask them, okay, why are you successful? You'll get lots of answers that have nothing to do with them. Oh, I ended up going to Harvard because my parents are smart. I ended up getting promoted because I'm lucky. I ended up landing that contract because, the people thought I was very friendly or they took pity on me. The successes of people with imposter syndrome are actually never taken on by themselves. So they always attribute their successes to some external factor or luck. And when you do that, what that sort of means is that you can't log a W in the W column, right? Because you don't really deserve to be successful. That success has nothing to do with your actual competence. And so this is what's really interesting. There's actually research that shows that you can actually ask someone with imposter syndrome to think a little bit about what they did to deserve a win. And this is the kind of thing that we'll teach our coaches, and it actually works surprisingly well, is simply to ask someone, so anytime you have some sort of accomplishment, you sort of think a little bit about what you did to deserve it, and think a little bit past your knee-jerk reactions for why you're successful. So instead of just assuming that you were lucky and that's why you got an A, it turns out that I missed one review session and that review session wasn't on a test. That's why I got the A. Whereas this person is ignoring the 90% of the stuff that they did right. They went to class every day. They did their homework every day. They went to all the other review sessions that were on the test. They got notes from a friend. So there's a really interesting cognitive pattern that happens in people with imposter syndrome, which is that they actually devalue their own efforts that lead to success. So what you want to do if you struggle as an imposter is anytime you're successful, pay attention to that first thing that your mind says, which is that you're lucky, and instead think a little bit about what did you do to deserve this. The second cognitive pattern that maintains imposter syndrome is that we attribute other people's successes to hard work. So when someone else gets promoted, when someone else gets an A, that's because they worked really hard and they really deserve it, right? They didn't get lucky. There was no nepotism involved or anything like that. Everyone else's successes, they deserve. But my successes, I don't deserve. So the second cognitive pattern that we need to attack is that one. So this is a situation where when you see someone else succeed, what is your default response in your mind? Wow, they really deserve it. And so this is where what we actually want to do is flip the script a little bit and start to ask yourself, well, what are the advantages that they had? In what ways did they get lucky? And even articulating some of this stuff starts to challenge this cognitive pattern. The third cognitive pattern in imposter syndrome is an emphasis on pleasing others. So when you're successful or not, it really has nothing to do with you. So your idea of success, if you're an imposter, is what do other people think? So if I get an A, and this is where kind of that high achieving families dynamic comes in, when I get an A, what do other people think about it? That's what imposters care about. So if you're a kid who grew up with a sibling who was a golden child, even if you get an A, no one is proud of that accomplishment in and of itself, right? They're not proud of that accomplishment. What they're proud of, what you're kind of doing is you're comparing your accomplishments to other people. So one of the things that we know about people with imposter syndrome is they're very, very concerned with external opinions and external validation. And that's why we're so terrified of everything coming crashing down, and people will it'll be revealed that we're imposters and we don't actually deserve our success. So when you succeed, the mind of someone with imposter syndrome is going to default to thinking about what other people think. So when I get an A on a test, I'm not happy until my parents say, "Good job, kid, you're so smart." When I do a good job at work, what I really care about, I can't relax or feel competent or feel proud until my boss says, "Good job." And once I've made my boss happy, I have maintained the scam, right? This is another day that's gone by at work where they haven't figured out I'm incompetent. And my boss still thinks that I'm a good person, right? So we really care what other people think, and we're not able to take pride in our own accomplishments. The idea that I can be proud of something and someone else may be disappointed in it is completely foreign to someone with imposter syndrome. That just does not compute at all. There's no way I can be proud of something and someone else be disappointed in something. And so this is the thing that we kind of want to tackle, is to develop a sense of pride in our own accomplishments. And that too can be done somewhat simply by simply asking yourself, okay, when you do a good job at something, how do you feel about it? And you may say, well, how do I know if I've done a good job? Well, you just think about it for a second, right? So if you went to work today, you can ask yourself, what can I be proud of that I did today? If you cooked a meal, what can you be proud of? What are you actually satisfied with? Was the meal tasty to you? Was there any part of it that you can be proud of? And the key thing is that people with imposter syndrome actually skip this step. They try really hard to skip that step. And they substitute it with, well, what did other people think about the meal that I made? So if you want to challenge this cognitive pattern of imposter syndrome, just stop for a second and think a little bit about, what can I take pride in? What can I actually be proud of? So at the end of the day, imposter syndrome is something that we're seeing more and more and more. And bizarrely, the people with imposter syndrome are the ones that kind of deserve it the least. So the more accomplished you are, the more likely you are to feel imposter syndrome. And we've seen this a lot in our career coaching program, in our creator coaching program, where we work with people like YouTube creators and Twitch creators, and all of them have imposter syndrome. And why is that? It's because imposter syndrome is not actually, while it's harmful, it's also adaptive. So it's a harmful adaptation. And how is it adaptive? Well, that's because someone with imposter syndrome, instead of celebrating when they do a good job, what they actually do is panic and work twice as hard. And if you really think about it, instead of celebrating, if you're panicking all the time and working twice as hard, do you suffer? Sure. But you're also going to be very, very, very accomplished and very successful because you're working hard all the time. And as people are able to acknowledge the things that they've done that deserve success, as people are able to acknowledge that if someone else is successful, maybe they got a little bit lucky too. And lastly, as people are able to take pride in themselves instead of relying on someone else's validation, that's when you start to see imposter syndrome get a lot better.